As typical of most of the projects we construct here in the Woodworking at Home shop, we try to maximize the use of all available space. And this particular project is one of those projects that will maximize the amount of usable floor space we can get in this small area. Now what we've got here is, of course, a bench tool, a storage cabinet, and workbench. We've got a hollow chisel mortiser, our belt sander, and oscillating spindle sander. Now these two tools I use quite frequently, so I always have them up on this bench and at the ready. The oscillating spindle sander is one of those tools that I don't use all the time. Generally I use it for when I'm doing curvy type work. So at that station, we've allowed and designed into the system the ability to swap out that tool with either a scroll saw or our precision sharpening system, which is our lap sharp tool. So this station here, you can take this tool out, store it in its drawer, get it out of the way, put up the scroll saw or the other tool. These two tools are movable so that you've got greater access and control over using them. We've incorporated a pull-out work support for the mortiser. This also serves double duty as a very small, narrow drawer. Now, because of this large cavity in the upper portion of this cabinet, we've also thought that it'd be good to have a couple of other long, skinny drawers. One off of this side that comes out about 48 inches. It's the perfect place to store all of your dowel rods. We've also got a mating drawer on this end that can also be used for dowel rods. Now the three large drawers are to store large tools. We've got our precision sharpening system here, our lap sharp tool. Down here we've got a small drawer for storing scroll saw blades and other accessories for the scroll saw, which is stored in this drawer. All the drawers down here on the front are mounted on ball bearing slides. So when you're designing or working with your project, you may want to take into consideration the actual physical size of your tools. Over here we've got another small accessory drawer. That space could have gone to waste, but we thought it'd be important to take advantage of it. This large drawer is for storing the oscillating spindle sander. And up here we've got a wide variety of belts for the belt sander, as well as some of the sleeves for the oscillating spindle sander, more sleeves for the spindle sander, and more discs for the belt sander. So as you can see, there's an awful lot going on in this particular project. We're providing you with a large amount of storage space, a way to get rid of a lot of the clutter, and a way to organize a lot of the accessories for each of these machines. Now as we go through the construction of this project, don't hesitate to think about modifications to suit the tools that are in your particular shop. We don't expect that you'll have exactly this combination of tools and machines. So if you see something that, well, gee, my scroll saw is a little bit bigger or my oscillating spindle sander is a little smaller, don't hesitate to make modifications. We're going to show you 3 different designs of drawers, each having its own purpose and reason for its construction. So we'll go through and point that out along the way as well. So without any further delays, let's dive in and get this project underway. This project is constructed primarily out of 3/4 inch thick and 1/2 inch thick birch plywood. It's the type that you pick up at your local home center. And of course the most economical method is to pick it up in its 4x8 sheet form. Now breaking down those panels into more manageable pieces can be a bit of a challenge. Here in our shop we have our shop-built panel cutting saw. We will be presenting a story on how to construct one of those in a future issue. However, here's a pointer. At the home center, when you pick up your plywood, you may want to have them cut it down into the overall sizes of some of your components. So that way at least you get it broken down into something more manageable than a 4x8 sheet. So we'll get started over at the panel cutting saw. We'll trim everything up to size at the table saw, and then we can go on to the joinery machining. While the panel's still at its full width, it's very easy to cross-cut it to its overall length in a ripping operation. Then we can spin the parts around and rip them to their proper width. And of course we can use our compound miter saw to cross-cut our narrow stock to its proper length. Nearly all of our components will interlock together with a dado joint. This creates a very strong structure. To machine those dados and grooves, I'm using a 3/4 inch stacked dado head cutter. I've got it raised up 1/8 of an inch. Now I'll adjust my fence over for the various positions of each of the grooves. Now you'll notice when I'm feeding the stock over, I'm using these grippers to help force the workpiece down tight against the table saw's surface. That assures me that I get a nice consistent depth on my groove. Now I'm ready to start machining the dados. Now one question that comes up from our viewers is, what's the difference between a dado and a groove? A groove is a dado that runs with the grain. A dado is a groove that runs cross grain. So in other words, they're the same thing, it's just dependent upon which direction it is relative to the grain on the wood that you're cutting. Now to cut these short dados that go across the grain, I'm going to be using a white side 3/4 inch router bit in my handheld router. I've got a straight edge clamp to the work, and now it's just a matter of indexing this straight edge clamp to the proper location and taking each of the cuts. After getting all of my 3/4 inch wide by 1/8 inch deep dados in my top and bottom panels, as well as the left side panel, now I can start cutting the 1 inch wide dados. All I need to do is change out to a 1 inch diameter router bit, and of course I'll have to calculate a new offset for my guide fence. So make sure you take care of that step. Now it's just a matter of make these last 4 cuts and we're almost ready for some assembly. Along the top edge of our inner and outer side panels, as well as the drawer hanger, we need to make a series of cutouts. And these allow for the drawers to slide in and out. I'll be using my jigsaw. I've already done the layout, so it's just a matter of taking a few cuts. Getting ready to start on assembly now, I'm focusing my attention on the top. I've got it upside down on my workbench here. Now in this area here will be our pull-out work support. This section will be the drawer that opens that way, and this channel will be the drawer that opens in this direction. Now what we have to do is join together all these pieces to create these tunnels. Now we could just nail in from the outside edge for these end boards. However, in the center area it's hard to nail in when you've got 2 boards joined together like so. So I'm going to be using pocket hole screws, drilling through the bottoms and into these supports. And I'll place them about every 10 inches apart. Now you'll notice that this one and this one, which are on the left side, stand proud of our braces by 2 1/4 inches. On this one, it's standing proud at the other end 2 1/4 inches. Now I've made my marks so I can get the layout right. Now what I can do is apply some glue and screw everything together, and then we can bring this assembly together. And that fits in there fine. Now we can attach this assembly to the undersurface of our top. All that's going to hold that in place is glue. And we'll clamp that up and allow it to dry. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the drawer hanger and hanger brace. Now the hanger will be held to the undersurface of the top using pocket hole screws, but we have to be very careful because as we drive them through, we don't want them to come through the front side or the top side of our top. So I'm left my jig set up for 1/2 inch thick stock, even though this is 3/4 inch, and I'm going to be using 1 inch long pocket hole screws to fasten it. So I'll get those holes drilled, and then we can assemble our hanger and our hanger brace. Joining together the 2 pieces that make up the drawer support and the brace requires a little bit of glue, a couple of brads, and some screws. Now the whole purpose of these 2 brads are to help hold everything in alignment while we drive in the screws. We'll drill a pilot hole, and we'll drive in 5 1 1/4 wood screws. After a dry assembly to make sure everything was fitting up right, I'm ready to bring the inner left side panel into position. Now that'll just get held to the top with glue. Now with glue in the dados, we can bring our drawer hanger assembly into position. And that will fit into the dado on the side of the cabinet and on the undersurface of the top. And then we can drive in our 1-inch pocket hole screws. Now if this looks a little confusing, you are looking at it upside down and through where the back panel will be. And now we can glue in our right inner side panel. Again, this pretty much just gets held in place with glue. If you want to throw a screw in somewhere, it's all right, nothing wrong with that. And now we can get ready to put the bottom on. Again, this is upside down and you're looking at it through the back side. We can drive in some 1¼ inch wood screws to hold the bottom onto the inner side panels. Now we can install the bottom braces. I've already gone through, pre-drilled and countersunk the holes for the mounting screws, of which we'll be using 1½ inch long wood screws. And I'll space them out about 10 inches apart. To give our cart mobility, I've selected these very heavy-duty casters. Now these are big industrial units, and I did get them at an industrial supply house. And we'll put that information on the plans. Now I don't know if you'll be using the same casters, so we're not going to give you dimensions as to where to mount them and so forth. But just kind of follow along. What you want to do is keep them forward as far as possible and back for the back wheels, and outboard as far as possible. You just don't want your bolts lining up with your dados or in this area here, which will actually be sealed off. So just find a spot, make sure it can spin around and doesn't hit our braces, drill your holes and mount them up. Then I'll tighten them up with a washer and a nut. The back panel gets held on with glue and 1¼ inch screws. Now you can make your back panel out of either 3/4 inch birch plywood or 1/2 inch birch plywood. If you're going with 1/2 inch birch plywood, it'll just look like the back is sitting in a deep recess. Now when you bring the back into position, you need to make sure that it's a 1/2 inch in from this outside edge of both the top and bottom. And that's to allow for the outer side panels to fit in. And a few more along the bottom. And now we can finally install the outer side panels. I've glued it in place, checked it for clearance where my drawers are going to go, and now what I'll do is tack it in place with some 1-inch brads. Moving on now to the face frame installation. Now, ideally you should use birch so that it looks appropriate for the birch plywood. However, I happen to have some ash and it wasn't of real high quality, so I'm going to use that for my face frame. Now, the one thing you may be wondering right now is why we have this double wall on the outsides of our cabinet. Now, keep in mind that the back panel will keep this cabinet from racking in this direction, only against the back portion of the cabinet. Up here towards the front, with just a single piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood on the bottom, and well, we do have a double here, but ideally just one at the top, we're not going to have a lot of anti-racking design into it at this point, even with this drawer support and brace. So by putting this double wall here, it gives us a place to attach our face frame, and with that double wall joining together at the top and bottom and sides with this face frame, it really strengthens up the whole structure. So that explains this double wall on the two sides. Now for some of you creative people out there, perhaps you might want to put a swing out door on the sides of these so that you have a little bit of extra storage space. In my case, I'm going to let it go to waste. Now installing the face frame, you can install face frames a number of different ways. You could use pocket hole screws and drill those prior to assembly from the inside coming out, and then that would draw the face frame tight against the plywood edge. You could just clamp it in place and let the glue dry. You could use biscuits, or you could use the old standby, which is a little bit crude, and that is brads, and that's what I'm going to be using on this one. So I've already got the top piece installed, and all I really had to do was just line that up nice and flush along the top edge and on the two ends. I got my left side installed. Now I'll go ahead, put in my right side, and then the bottom piece. After getting the glue on, we'll just carefully line it up so that it's nice and flush. And then I'll hold mine in place with 1¼ inch brads. And we can just slide in the bottom piece, line that up flush at both ends, and along this surface of our bottom panel, and tack that in place. Now you may be wondering why I made this so wide. Again, what we're trying to do is reinforce or strengthen this bottom surface because it's going to be carrying the load of these two bottom drawers. So by adding this on here and having it wide like so, it's going to act as a stiffener. Moving on to the drawers, we'll be starting out with our top 3 drawers. Well, actually one of them is the work support for the mortiser. Now they're all constructed the same way. We get started at the table saw by ripping the material to its width and of course cutting off the pieces to length over at the compound miter saw. Now one thing I'd like to point out, before you rip your material to its width, take some measurements and maybe even make a mock-up piece of the total overall height of your drawer to see if it's going to fit in the opening. There's a good chance that maybe your dados aren't quite deep enough, or there's some glue squeeze out, or some other obstruction in the way. So take your time, make a template, fit it into the opening first to determine the overall height of your drawer. Now I'll start out by first getting the 2 end pieces on, and these will be held on with glue and 1-inch brads. Now I'll get some glue on the edges. And I think we'll have the nice face going towards the inside of the little drawer. And then we'll just tack the bottom on with some 5/8 inch brads. That's it for the 3 side access drawers. Now let's put them in and see if they fit. Now I won't slide them in all the way because it's going to be very difficult to get them back out without a pull. Now we can move on to the next set of drawers. The rest of the small drawers get assembled the same way as we did for the side access drawers. We'll glue the front and sides together and tack them in place with some 1¼ inch brads. Then we'll glue the bottom on and tack it in place with some 5/8 inch brads. The 10 5/16 inch high drawer gets built around its bottom. The bottom is 3/4 inch, the sides, front and back, are 1/2 inch birch plywood. Now what we'll be doing is just bringing all the sides in and wrapping them around this base. Now our initial assembly will be with glue and 1¼ inch brads, and then we'll strengthen it up a little bit further with some wood screws. Now because the sides are just as long as the base is, I'll start out by getting the sides on. Then we can glue the ends on and tack those in place. On the bottom surface of our 2 large bottom drawers, we need to have a 1/8 inch deep by 1 inch wide groove machined in them, and that will receive the board that's going to hold the bearing mount. Now to machine those, I'm using my stacked dado head cutter, which is only set up at 3/4 inch wide. It is raised up at 1/8 inch. I've also got my rip fence set at 1/2 inch, which sets the spacing from the fence to the start of the groove. Now because my stacked dado head's 3/4 and I need a 1 inch wide groove, I need to make 2 passes. I'll run each board over and get it at 3/4 inches wide, shift my fence over 1/4 inch and make the second cut. Now for the 2 large bottom drawers, they get assembled more like the smaller drawers. We're going to build the box and then attach the bottom to it. So we'll start out by attaching the sides to the front and back using glue and 1¼ inch brads. And now for the bottom. Again, glue and 1¼ inch brads. And when you put your bottom on, make sure you can see your grooves. And now we'll reinforce these joints with some 1¼ inch number 8 wood screws. And of course I'll drill in countersink for them. Now here you can see where we've got our reinforcing screws. And I've only got one on the smaller drawers. On the larger drawers, I used one about every 6 inches. Now on our 10 5/16 inch deep drawer, our bottom is recessed on the inside. So we do want to add support for that so that the bottom can't fall out. So I've also added screws all the way around 6 inches apart to hold that bottom in. Now we can turn our attention to installing the drawers. Now if you've been paying close attention, you'll notice that we're missing our center stile. We'll be adding that in a minute. I just needed it off at this point to show you these mounting cleats for our rails that we have to install for our 3 upper right drawers. Now they'll get mounted in this location, and I've made my layout marks, and that was just a matter of subtracting 3/8 of an inch from each of the center line positions for where we need those drawers to go. I also took the time to drill the holes for the mounting screws. It was easier to lay them out on this side, drill through, even though we're going to be mounting our screw from this side. It was just easy to get it laid out at this point. So this is where those 3 kickers are going to go, or 3 cleats, and then we'll be mounting in our center stile. Now this will get fastened in place with a couple of pocket hole screws, 2 at each end, and these will get fastened against the sides with 1¼ inch long or 1½ inch long wood screws coming in from this direction. First we'll get the stile in place. And I've made marks on here already so I can get everything lined up. Then if you need to, place a clamp across the top and bottom to pinch this together so that the center stile doesn't move while you're tightening up your pocket hole screws. And now we can go ahead and install the 3 cleats that will hold the ball bearing guides. Now for the bottom drawers, we need to install this cleat on the bottom surface. Now it's 1 inch thick, and of course you'll cut it off to length. Now I was going to use hardwood, but I had some 1 inch thick plywood that I'd use instead. Now I've followed the drawing and made my layout mark from the top coming down, which shows me the center line of where I want the slide to be. Now the large portion of the slide will be mounted on this cleat. Now all I did was just line up the front edge flush, and then followed my center line along, mark my hole locations. Now I can drive in the screws. For the 2 small drawers at the bottom, what we need to do is make our layout mark for where the center line of the slide should be, and then we can mark out our hole locations. But there's one additional step on this. Now keep in mind that we've got our face frame on there that's 3/4 of an inch. So what I did was I took my drawer, placed it in the cabinet, and marked the front edge of where the mating component of the slide is. That tells me where the front of this piece should be. Now I can mark my hole locations and drive in the screws. Now this whole assembly gets glued and screwed into those dados we placed in the bottom. And I'll drive 1½ inch long wood screws through the bottom and into this assembly. And I'll also make sure I've got it slid all the way forward. Now for the 2 large bottom boxes, we got these cleats again. And what we'll do is we'll mount the small portion of the slide on there before we install the cleat to the bottom of the box, which just simply gets glued and screwed in place. Now I did have to mark the location at the front of where the front of the slide should be located. Made my layout mark. Now I'll transfer my hole locations and fasten everything in place. And all I need to do is screw it in through the drawer bottom into this cleat. Now we're down to installing the top 4 drawers, and they all get installed basically the same way. We're going to be working off of the center line dimensions, and those are given on the drawings. Now I like to use a storyboard to help with that, but it's kind of a modified storyboard. I just simply cut it off to the length of where I want the bottom edge of each of my slides to be. I've already got my top 2 drawers in, and I've cut off my storyboard. Now I'll place my slide in there, bring it up front with the front edge of the plywood, which is of course 3/4 of an inch back from the front of the cabinet, and then just mark my hole locations. And then we'll double check to make sure we're at the right height. This one should be 23¼ inches, and it looks like we're right. As you can see, it pays to double check. I goofed up and made them 1 inch too high my first time around. And that completes the installation of all of our drawers. Now I'd like to explain a few things as to why each of these drawers are constructed a little differently. Now the first thing I'd like to point out, these bottom drawers, of course, are riding on top of the glides. They're mounted to the bottom of the drawer. Now these larger drawers, this one and this one and this one, are designed to carry a large heavy load. I actually plan on putting tools right inside these drawers. So I want as much support on that bottom surface as I can get. By mounting the slides on the bottom of the drawer, all of the weight is supported directly above the slides. Now in this particular drawer, I couldn't mount my slides underneath it. There just wasn't room vertically, so I had to put them on the sides of the drawer, which explains why I recessed the bottom up inside the drawer box, and then we put screws in from the outside edge. All of the load on this drawer is carried through the sides. That in turn, as we put a load in here, we're putting that load down against the bottom, which is drawing down out of the sides. So by putting screws in this direction, that creates a shearing action on that screw. It's going to be very difficult for that drawer to fall apart. Now these 3 drawers up here and the 2 small drawers down here are relatively small drawers. So I'm not really concerned about how much weight I put in them. It's going to be very difficult to put a large amount of weight inside these drawers. They're just too small. So actually my intended purpose for these 3 drawers is to put sanding belts, discs and so forth, very small lightweight accessories. So I don't really need a very strong box. However, people claim that this type of construction is very, very weak. Well, from where I'm standing, I think they're mistaken. As you can see, this particular box is constructed the same way these 3 drawers are, or actually these 3 and the 2 bottom drawers. We have the 1/4-inch plywood bottom glued to the sides, but for demonstration purposes, I nailed on 6 legs to the sides, not to the bottom. So as I'm standing in there, this plywood surface is supporting my entire weight, roughly about 200 pounds. So these drawers actually are a lot stronger than people give them credit for. Now that we've got our drawers done and out of the way, we can turn our attention to putting on the false fronts and finishing up the rest of the details. Now as you can see, I've been busy putting the false drawer fronts on this side of the cabinet. Now we'll go ahead and do this side. Now I'm going to be making mine out of a single piece of plywood, and that allows us to get some continuity with the grain pattern so that it looks relatively attractive. Even though this is shop cabinetry, you might as well just do your best to make it look nice. Then to finish off the edges, I'm using ash, which is my hardwood that I used everywhere else, and I ripped some thin strips, and we'll attach that around the perimeter of each of these fronts. So we'll start at the table saw by ripping and cross-cutting each of our false fronts. Now we have our 3 drawer fronts, our top, our large bottom one, and then our small bottom one. I'm not going to try and make a perfect match here by very carefully cutting out that opening. Rather, I'll just use the next piece down for that bottom drawer that gets inset. Now what we need to do is create that cutout at the bottom of our large drawer. Following the dimensions on the plans, I've laid out my cutout area, and this is on the back side because I'm going to make 2 cuts going in this direction first with a jigsaw. I don't want that splintering to be on the front face. So I'll make those 2 cuts, and then we'll use a router to make the long straight cut. Now I find that when I'm guiding my jigsaw, if I use a speed square, which is a carpenter's tool, but it comes in handy for woodworking, if I use a speed square as a guide, I generally get a little bit straighter of a cut. Now we're set up for this long cut. To make that, I'll be using my handheld router. I've got a 1/4-inch diameter straight cutting router bit in there. It's a white side bit. Now I'm using my plunge router. I've got my depth stop set, and I did measure the distance from the edge of my router base to the edge of the router bit to create my offset. Now we can quickly make that cut. And we can quickly touch up the corners with the jigsaw. To finish off all the edges, I'm going to be using some 1/4-inch thick strips of ash. Now what I started out with was a 3/4-inch thick board of ash. I planed it down to a 1/2-inch thickness, actually a little bit less because as we know, plywood's never the actual thickness. And then I went about ripping these 1/4-inch wide strips like so, and then that's what we'll be fastening all the way around. Now when ripping thin strips like this, we have to make sure that we're guiding our workpiece tight against the fence, and we have to maintain control of it while it's in that area. So either use a crudely fashioned push stick or use one of these, and these work great for feeding thin stock such as we're about to do. Now we can start cutting our strips to length. And I'll be doing my side banding first. I'm going to cut them just a shave long. I'm not going to be using a miter joint in this application, just a basic butt joint. We'll keep it nice and simple. To hold our edge banding on, I'm going to be using glue. Now this is my good face, so I'll put that down against my surface here. And we'll put the strip like so, and bring the two into contact with each other. Now this next step, we're going to show you a couple of different options. Now of course we need to hold that on there securely until that glue sets up. Now you can use brad nails, but they're going to leave a very large dimple there, and it's rather unattractive. As an alternative, you can use a micro pin nailer, and that's what I'll be using. And these are so small they're darn near invisible. But as you can see, I'm pushing our false front flat against the bench, then pushing down on our strips so that they're both flush on the other side, and then put in a brad. Now at this point, as I mentioned, I cut mine just a little bit long and it's sticking out above and below. We'll flush that up a little bit later. Now if you don't have a pin nailer, you can of course use an edge clamp. This is a very elaborate one, relatively expensive. In fact, you can probably get a pin nailer for about the cost of two of these. But that's one clamping option. And another option is to use these large parallel clamps. And of course you could put a couple of them on there and get just about this entire front clamped up. But again, that's rather big and it's time consuming, and if you don't have a lot of clamps, that could be a bit of a problem. Good old-fashioned masking tape can be a very effective clamp for putting edge banding on. Edge banding is not structural, so we don't have to have a perfect bond, but if we wrap the tape over like so, pull good tension on it, and then adhere it to the sides, we actually get a pretty decent amount of clamping force holding our edge banding in place. Now as I mentioned, when I attached my side pieces, I cut them a little bit long rather than try and fight it and get them absolutely perfect. Now to make them flush, I fashioned a sanding block out of a piece of plywood with adhesive back sandpaper. Now I can just lay that on there like so, work it back and forth, and we've got it sanded up nice and flush. Now working with a nice long board like this makes it easy so you don't end up sanding it at an angle or something like that. It gives you a nice guide. So I'll get all my ends sanded up, and then we can put our edge banding on the tops and bottoms of each of our false fronts. For that small drawer that goes in this opening, we do want the grain, of course, to line up. So what I'm going to do, I've already put my strips on the larger drawer opening, so I'll just lay another 1/4 inch strip in here and just kind of eyeball about a 1/8 inch gap. Do that at both ends. And now I can cut off this piece to its length and wrap that one with the edge banding. Well, with the drawer fronts all sanded up now and edge banded, we're ready to install them on the cabinet. Now I've gone through and made a layout mark, a 1/4 inch over from the inside edge of my left stile, 1/4 inch up from the bottom edge of my top rail. I've placed some double-faced tape on all of the drawer boxes, and that's going to be used to help hold our drawer front in place until we can fasten it to the drawer box with some number 8 by 3/4 inch long sheet metal screws. Now I'll just very carefully line this up with my layout marks, press it in place, and then we can attach the drawer. Now I can drill some pilot holes, and for a drawer face about this big, I'll probably put 9 total screws in here because they're rather small. This is a very large front. Now when we install our next drawer front, I'm using a piece of 1/8 inch thick aluminum. You could use wood, of course, it doesn't really matter. It's only a shim. And what that's going to do is establish our spacing between each of the drawer fronts. So we'll just line up our edges so that they're flush, push it in place, and fasten it on just like we did with the other drawers. And I'll repeat that for all the remaining drawers on the cabinet. And that wraps up the drawer fronts. Now for pulls, you can really use whatever suits your fancy. I myself really haven't determined yet what I'm going to be using for pulls, either knobs or a conventional drawer pull. But pick whatever suits your fancy. That would be the next step on your drawers, or you could do that after finishing. Now, of course, on your slide out narrow drawers that are side access, you'll do a false front on those the same way we did on the front. The one that I'm using for my mortiser work support, I just sized it larger so that when the mortiser is sitting here and stock is coming out, we can slide this out and give support to a longer workpiece. Of course, you'll have to almost custom make that for your particular tool or mortiser or whatever you're using in this station. Or you could just use it as a simple small drawer. Now there's one more detail that I'd like to tend to, and it has to do with this edge of the plywood along the top and the bottom. And all I really did was rip some thin strips of this ash, and as it would be, it's nice straight grain, so it almost looks like the edge of plywood, but I'm going to glue that right over the area where that plywood is, and that will conceal the plywood edge a little bit. However, I did go through already and sand this and kind of rounded it over, so it's not going to fit up real nice, but I'll see what I can do for blending and so forth with the sander. Now what I'll do is I'll just bring it into position, kind of resting on top of my drawers at the moment, and on the front edge here you can see I just beveled it over so it kind of blends back in toward the cabinet. Now I'll hold it up proud so that I got about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch gap between the bottom edge of this strip and the top edge of my drawer. Bring it up flush. Tack it in place with a brad, or actually a pin nail. And then when the glue sets up on that, we can sand the top off flush. Now if you want to get real fancy, you can of course trim out around each of your holes where the drawers go in. Frankly, with the overlay drawer, you're not going to see that anyhow. And put a strip along the bottom edge to conceal the plywood down there. To give our project a little more color, I'm using a water-based stain. We got a nice humid day today, so it's going to be relatively easy to work with. We'll just brush on a good wet layer, let it soak in for a couple minutes, wipe off the excess with a dry rag. Now a lot of people get caught up in finishing and think there's an awful lot of black magic to it in art and so forth. And for me, finishing has more been along the lines of just following the directions on the can. I know that's probably not the most popular thing in the world for many males to do, but I find that if I follow the directions on the can, I get in a whole lot less trouble. So that's what I do. I'm just going to brush on a good wet coat, let it soak in for a few minutes, wipe off the excess with a dry rag. And that should do the trick. Now we'll wait a little while, let this stain dry very thoroughly, then we can go on to our top coat. I've gone through and applied 3 coats so far of a water-based polyurethane. And I'm just applying it using one of these foam brushes. Now for the top surface, I'll actually end up with about 6 coats on there. Again, I'm going to sand lightly between each of the coats. Well, as you can see, I've got my finishing done. Now I did go through and do a 2-tone stain job on it. I ended up staining my drawer fronts a little darker color, made them a little more attractive. I also installed some black knobs on them. After the finish had a chance to dry thoroughly, it took about 3 or 4 days, I then waxed the top, and that's going to allow for free movement of the tools while they're on the top, because we do want to be able to slide them around, and we'll show you that a little bit later. But I am going through and mounting up some of the tools. Now the mortiser is pretty much going to always be on top of the bench, as is the belt sander. These are 2 tools that I use quite frequently, so I always want them at the ready. Now I'm attaching them to the top with a cleat system. It's a very, very simple system, and it's going to be using some 1/8 inch thick by 1 inch wide aluminum, extruded aluminum strips that you can pick up at the home center or most hardware stores. But that allows us to slide the tools fore and aft. And then at our final station over here, this station will be swapping out 3 different tools. Our oscillating spindle sander, our scroll saw, as well as our precision sharpening system. So this area gets swapped out. Now I've got all my rails mounted up, or the mounting cleats, and we'll just kind of walk you through the process on our last cleat. Now I'd like to show you here at the workbench the scroll saw and how we put an adapter plate on the bottom of that. Now at the station where we're going to be swapping out the tools, I've gone through and put on a 1/2 inch thick plywood base. Now the 3 tools that'll be swapped out, we need that base to be the same width. And that way they'll all fit in the tracks the same way. I attached this plywood to the machines using some flathead machine screws, 1/4-20, with a washer, a nut, and then I capped it off with an acorn nut. And that way you don't catch your finger on there and get cut on those exposed threads. Now of course you'll have to size the base to fit your tools and size the length of the screws to fit your tools. Now we do want the edge of the plywood to overhang slightly from the edge of the machine. And as you can see here, I've got basically 1/4 inch sticking out of the plywood from the edge of the machine. Now my aluminum track is 1/8 inch thick by 1 inch wide, and I've got this cleat that we're going to mount it to. And that is slightly thicker, about a 32nd of an inch thicker than the plywood bottom. And this is hardwood, I just used ash. Now what we'll do is we'll screw these 2 pieces down onto our workbench top. And then that will allow the tool to slide in and out, but it won't be able to tip up either back like so or down forward like so. Now the next thing we'll need to do is lay out our hole locations for our mounting screws. Now I've found the center based on our wooden cleat so that I've got my distance from the edge, and then I've come in 1 inch from each end and then about 4 inches apart across there. And I'll be mounting it with a total of 5 screws. Now I've got my workpiece clamped down on my table, so now I can go ahead and start drilling the holes. Now we're using number 8 wood screws, so we'll be drilling a 3/16 pilot hole. Now with the chamfering tool and the drill press, we can take the burr off the backside and put a nice countersink on the front side of the strip. Now with the strip flush on one edge and overhanging on the other, I'm going to center punch 2 of the hole locations. Then I'll go through and drill my clearance hole for the screw. Now this aluminum strip you can cut with a hacksaw or a jigsaw or a number of different tools. Now you will have a sharp edge there, so take a file and knock off that sharp edge. Now for each of the tool stations, I attach my first cleat. Just screwed that in place, making sure it's square to the end of our cabinet. Now we can slide our tool in against that cleat, make sure it's in there tight. Now what we want is a gap on the other side, about a 1/64 of an inch. And I've just cut up some very thin cardboard into some thin strips that I can place against this edge so that I end up with a 1/64 of an inch gap. Now you'll notice that I've got 2 screws in here where we drilled those pilot holes. I'm going to line up the front edge of this clamp / cleat with the front edge of the plywood top. That means it's set back 3/4 of an inch from the front. And I'll just hold that up against our tool. And then I'm going to tap these screws. That's set their position. Now I can tighten them up with my screwdriver. And now we can go ahead and finish up installing the 3 remaining screws. And that fits up good. Now we'll test to make sure that the other tools fit in this spot, and then we can finish up the project. Now as I mentioned a moment ago, these 2 tools are always going to be up on the bench and at the ready. So why go through the trouble of putting them in these clamps and cleats? Well, if I'm working with the belt sander, I can slide it forward, even allowing it to overhang the workbench a little bit. That gives me good access to the disc sander as well as to the belt sander portion. When I'm working with the mortiser, I can slide these tools back, allow for long stock to continue on in that direction, pull out my work support on this end, and have good support for my work. Now when I'm working with the oscillating spindle sander, that would pretty much probably just sit right in the center of the bench. However, the scroll saw, when that's in this station, I may want to have it overhang a little ways, pull up a stool, and sit there comfortably while I'm doing my scroll saw work. Now a couple things I'd like to point out on the design of this cabinet. As you can see, it's relatively high. It's at a very good height for my mortiser. It's at a very good height for my precision sharpening station, the lap sharp tool. The belt sander's a little bit high. The oscillating spindle sander is perhaps a little bit high, but it's really not too bad, especially if your eyes are getting old like mine. Your arms, well, they're just never at the right length, so bringing the work up good and close makes it a little bit easier to work with. Same thing is true for the scroll saw. The scroll saw table's down about here, so it's at about the perfect height for me. But you may want to take that into consideration, the overall height of this cabinet. I'm 6 foot tall, and you can see how all the tools are relative to my height. Now you can, of course, shorten it up by putting smaller casters on it. You can also change the height of some of the drawers. Keep in mind, these drawers are sized specifically for this variety of bench tools. Odds are really good you won't have the exact same collection as I do. So you can also modify your drawer heights a little bit, either raising or lowering the overall height of your workbench. So that wraps up this project. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. I hope you get plenty of good years of service out of our bench tool storage cabinet and workbench.